shops are constantly full, but shelves are empty. Businesses have been shut down and schools have been closed. Tanyaradzwa Kaseke is a 16-year-old who wrote a letter on the impact of the virus on the youth. She joins us now via Skype for more on this. Thank you very much, Tanya, for your time this afternoon. A very interesting letter that you have penned. While most students are sighing a breath of relief for this time, you're not quite satisfied. Why is that?
Definitely not. I think the issue with what's going on currently in terms of how education is being dealt with and how we're looking at how we should be helping the youth with in terms of the COVID-19 crisis is that we haven't done enough and we haven't made enough measures to ensure that the people who need the help the most in terms of education are catered for, and those are children at government and public schools.
You have said something here that is quite poignant. You say, we have coined the term African solutions for African problems and allowed it to simply become a propaganda tool, something that is never realistically enacted when it comes to legislation and policy. And to your point about children who are from less privileged backgrounds, do you believe that this is more so where that is concerned? Why are you concerned about this?
Yes, definitely. I think the biggest reason for concern is that as a child at a private school, so I go to Sacred Heart College, it's been incredibly easy for me to adapt to the online schooling problem. And in terms of those children who go to government schools, it hasn't been easy for them because they don't have that internet connection. They don't have those resources to be able to still be communicating with teachers. And that's obviously detrimental in terms of their schooling because that could set them back quite a bit.
You say COVID-19 has pushed mass hysteria in the public to a dangerous extent, where there is mass hysteria of people surrounding why exactly our government has effectively abandoned the poor at the time at which they need help the most. You feel that our governments are letting us down?
Yes, definitely. I think what needed to happen in terms of the COVID-19 crisis was to firstly take into account that in a South African context, it's virtually impossible for the poorest of the poor to actually socially distance. I do say in the article that there's about 1.5 million people in Soweto, and that's a space that's about 272 kilometers squared. And that's just not realistic because the virus will spread rapidly. So I think what needed to happen was that the government needed to take these facts into account, also taking into account that a large majority of our population is immunocompromised.
Indeed. You talk about the fact that the youth indeed is the future. So you are tomorrow's leaders. In a scenario like this, what would you have done, or if you were to advise government at all, what would your word be?
I think my advice to government would simply be to remember why these people are not able to enact the social distancing and actually put those measures in place. So, for example, in places like the UK, they've committed a large amount of money to individuals who won't be able to work during the crisis to make sure that these individuals don't starve and that these individuals are still able to provide for their families. The government hasn't necessarily put into place those same measures for people like car guards, security guards, domestic workers, and those are the people that make up the majority of our society.
What have you made in your letter? You describe it, but please share with our viewers what you have made you talk about tuning into the radio or turning on your television, and you cannot run away from anything COVID-19 related. What has been your assessment where that is concerned?
I think it's definitely necessary to an extent to document COVID-19 to the fullest extent and be able to make sure that people have the correct information. But there also needs to be, to some extent, a sort of hope that is inspired in the people, because what the media has done to this extent and effectively is that they've encouraged this mass hysteria, but they're also not highlighting the real issues that need to be dealt with. So, for example, I don't think we're talking about the children at government schools enough. I don't think we're talking about enough the people who can't social distance. I don't think there's enough focus on people who are immunocompromised.
Tanyaradzwa Kaseke, perhaps a final word to you, to your peers, to those listening, to officials and policymakers, two schools of thoughts on this, that perhaps this was, what the continent needed for leaders to sit up and take consideration. And after this, we need to have very, very difficult conversations. Another school of thought saying that, well, they're doing the best that they can. So you have somebody's ear right now who could make a difference. What would you say?
I think the biggest thing that I could say to anybody who wants to make a difference is that we should all remember in this situation that injustice anywhere still means injustice everywhere. So that's simply to say that just because you're sitting at home comfortable and this crisis has only affected you as much as that you can't leave the house, it's important for all of us to remember that there are people who are greatly affected. So in terms of policy making going forward, I do think the government needs to take into account those forgotten actors, the people who weren't initially recognized as individuals who wouldn't be able to work during this crisis, but are still individuals who need to work daily to make a living.
Tanyaradzwa Kaseke, a very big thank you to you, a 16-year-old youth who's very uncomfortable with what she's seeing in the world and making her voice heard. We'll definitely have that article up for you on enca.com.